Hello, everyone. It's 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, which goodness only knows what time it is over in North America for all my North American viewers. But I thought I'd do you an afternoon session in UK time just so that some of my North American folks could actually join us and not be waking up at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so, therefore, apologies to all my viewers over in Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Philippines. This is miles ahead of your time. And what on earth are you still doing up watching YouTube at this time on a Friday night? Anyway, it's lovely to be with you all. Hope you're all very well. Those of you in Britain in particular, hope you've all survived the fun and games that we've been having with the big storm that's just hit us, Storm Kieran. I've been away for a few days, actually. I've been over in Lisbon in Portugal, which was really cool. My partner's a teacher, so unfortunately, we have to take school, go on holiday at school holiday time. So great. I've got to that point in life where I've got rid of my kids, thought I'd have cheap holidays, and I've ended up with a partner who's a school teacher, and I end up having holidays in school holiday time at peak seasons. There you go. Lisbon, great place. Don't know if anyone's been. Really, really good. I'm just looking here, and I will keep just looking down at comments because so many of you are making comments. So, oh, wow, we have got the North American contingent are here. Hello, Sean. Hello, Chip over in Virginia. Grant in Norway. Nice to see you as well. Good to have the Norwegians. I've got something for Scandinavian fans in a moment. David from Spain. Well, yeah, there you go. So this is Chris in Pegasus Bridge in France. No, I wasn't. The holding photo was at Pegasus Bridge in Normandy, site of the airborne landing, or the British airborne landing, should I say, in 1944, D-Day. It was a couple of years ago now, just before COVID. I went over there. Great place. Anyone who's thinking about going to Normandy, and of course next year is where are we at? The 180th anniversary of the D-Day landings next June. I thoroughly recommend it. It's it's thought-provoking. It is thought-provoking. Certainly, standing at the shores, I went down onto Sword Beach, one of the British beaches, went right down to the shoreline and looked back up at where the Germans would have been. And as you, as a young British person coming off the boats, would have been storming up those beaches. And it was, What's weird, of course, is it's actually quite a short distance, but when you're being fired at, it sure as hell isn't. Great. The Canadian beach and memorial there is also really good. And certainly when I went, the Canadians have made a decision that they wouldn't have grizzled old veterans doing talks for everyone there. They would actually employ young interns, basically of the ages that the troops would have been in 1944, which I think is quite a clever one. And Omaha Beach, yeah, anyone who's seen Saving Private Ryan, it is again an incredible beach. And when you're there, you realise I went into a German pillbox further up on sort of halfway up the cliffs, and you realise the field of fire they had on the beaches was unbelievable. It's more actually, if anything, I'm surprised that anyone managed to get off Omaha Beach on D-Day 1944. The graveyard up above, which of course in Band of Brothers, in Saving Private Ryan, that's where he's almost, the film starts and he sort of reminisces there. Again, a very, very good cemetery, very thought-provoking. Thoroughly recommend it. And what's absolutely bizarre is Omaha was this absolute bloodbath, and then just around the corner, sort of, Utah was almost, I wouldn't quite call it unopposed, but compared to Omaha, it was pretty unopposed. And of course, one of the great ones there was that Theodore Roosevelt's son was one of the American generals on the beach at Utah Beach. And I always find it fascinating how people, and you see this in some of my talks, don't you, how their sons or their cousins or whatever get tangled up in other stories in history, which I love. And we still got more people coming in. We've got Netherlands. Hello, lovely trams in Lisbon, says David. Yes, sorry, I was going to tell you, I went to Lisbon. That's where this we'll haul ourselves out of this rabbit hole, shall we, and get back to Lisbon. Thoroughly, really, really good city for anyone who's never been. It's built on several hills, so you've got to get your walking boots on. However, as David has just said, you can go on the trams. They are these great trams from the 1930s. They're like rickety old things that go up the little streets in Lisbon, and they're great. And dirt cheap as well, certainly dirt cheap compared to London Underground and London Transport. Really, really good place. Some great history, and of course, what I was uncovering some of the history there when I was there. I know I specialise in British history because I live here in Britain, and yeah, I love it. And of course, everything around me relates to British history. But that's not to say somehow I'm I have this superiority thing. I don't think other histories are great. So being in Lisbon was amazing because, of course, the amount of the early days of exploration that the Portuguese did, especially around Africa, was huge. And people forget they had a sizable empire, of which Brazil was one of them, not the whole of the current Brazil geographically, but the coastline. And I always like to point out as well that actually, the Brazilians were heavily involved in the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, not trying to get the British off the hook, but just saying, we weren't the only ones. A lot of other folk were in there as well. The French were in it. The Dutch most certainly were in it. Funny enough, the Swedes, the Danes, there was some other Baltic trading ports who were involved in transatlantic slave trade in a much smaller way. And the Portuguese were one of the big players. And of course, the Portuguese held their colonial empire until the 1970s. So in Africa, they were holding vast colonial territories where they were really the last Europeans to vacate their colonial empires in Africa. And again, people forget that. And I was reading that when the Portuguese pulled out of principally Angola and Mozambique, something like 1 million white Portuguese, and many generations of white Portuguese who've been in those countries. They hadn't rocked up there in the last 20 years, but white Portuguese, mixed race Portuguese, and indeed some African supporters, people that have been on the wrong side, as it were, in those wars. Something like 1 million of them vacated those territories. It's a massive, back to Portugal, places like Brazil, South Africa, and people forget that. And yet it's in living memory. And again, it shaped part of the world. Hope you managed to visit the Torre de Belém in your trip. Yes, Stephen, I did. A great fort, the Torre de Belém, the fort. It's this really picturesque fort which guards, or used to guard, Lisbon on the mouth of the river to protect the port. Really cool. Also happened to go there as well to the local Portuguese tart, one of the best Portuguese tart cafes as well. So yeah, there you go. Right. So anyway, that's Lisbon. That's a bit about Lisbon. I hope some of you have managed to see my latest video. While I was away, I actually got a video out. I'd sort of got it in scheduled, as they say here on YouTube. It was about the football battalions in the British Army in the First World War. Really, there were 3 battalions that were made up of principally, or the core were made up of footballers. We had one up in Scotland, which was principally driven by a large part of the Heart of Midlothian team from Edinburgh, but many other footballers joined it. And then there were 2 battalions, part of the Middlesex Regiment down in England. And I tell the story of some of the players who ended up there. What's fascinating, of course, and I had a lot of comments about people, would today's footballers do anything like that? Are they all prima donnas? Well, I guess, would they do it? Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask them, really, wouldn't you? And I guess you have to put them in a World War situation. I mean, all I will say, as far as that sort of thing, is a lot of sports people in Ukraine have volunteered and have answered the call of their country. So I think a lot of footballers in this country, and rugby players and cricketers, would probably still do it if push came to shove. I'll be honest, as a dad with a lad in his early 20s, I'd be quite happy if we managed to avoid a world war. But there you go. So pre-Maradonas, yeah, thank you for asking. Yes, pre-Madonnas and pre-Maradonas. But so anyway, the football, I thought it was a good little story. A couple of them were awarded Victoria Crosses. What was really amazing was just how many of them, remember, most of them joined as privates, how many of them were commissioned during the First World War, which tends to show that actually sometimes sporting leadership and maybe man management or battlefield leadership do go hand in hand. But also, again, some sad stories. Obviously, a lot of them were killed. Disproportionate number were killed, actually. Out of something like 2,000 professional footballers who signed up, and most of them did sign up rather than wait for conscription in the First World War. 360 odd were killed. which is proportionally a pretty big deal. And of course, if many of them were getting leadership roles as non-commissioned officers or indeed officers, they would have been leading from the front. So I suppose, again, proportionately more likely to be killed. Just reading some of your comments. Plymouth Argyles did well in Singapore. Plymouth Argyles did well in Singapore. Okay, didn't know that, but thank you very much for that one. Thank you. I'm just reading. I am just pausing to read some of your comments because you're kind enough to make comments. I will try and keep up with you. Okay, so yeah, if you haven't had a chance, have a look at the Football Battalions. A great little story with a couple of interesting twists as well. So there. Flew in from, got in last night actually. We landed just before midnight, something like 10:30. So we just missed the back of Storm Kieran. I mean, I've never seen stewardesses come up and down the aisle checking your seatbelts as much as we did as we came over the Bay of Biscay last night, coming back from Lisbon. But it did remind me of one of my other videos that I did some time ago, about 2 years ago now. The Great Storm of 1703. I'll put a link in the description below, actually. So at the end of this, by all means, have a look at the Great Storm of 1703. There's also a link to the football battalions as well. 1703, again, very big storm, rather like we've just had with Storm Kieran, rather like the storm of 1987. Storm of 1987, which some of you will remember, is that famous one where a BBC weather forecaster, Michael Fish, said a lady has phoned up. He was doing the weather forecast. He says a lady's phoned up and said there's potentially going to be some tornadoes on the south coast of England. I don't think we need to worry about that sort of thing. And it's one of those monumental forecasts because that night this massive storm hit England, sort of took out forests and everything else. The Great Storm of 87. Actually, by storm force, a bigger storm than 1703, only just. 1703, however, what we actually had was we were a maritime nation in wooden boats. And I don't want to take away the story. I really think if you don't want to, this is one of those non-military ones that every now and then I'll just pop up and do. I'd really recommend it. But this storm hit Britain. There were ships, a lot of ships. There'd been a bad weather, so a lot of ships were all anchored off different ports in England, couldn't get into the ports for safety. There was almost like a backlog, and that's when the storm hit. The Royal Navy lost loads of ships, and we're talking of thousands of men, including hundreds stranded on the Goodwin Sands just off the coast of Kent, which are these sands, it's a sandbar which every now and then will show itself, but often is just below the waterlines. And the ships were stranded on the Goodwin Sands, and the hundreds of men, people from Deal in Kent, were watching through their telescopes at these men just standing on the sandbanks, watching the water come up. And it's a fair way to swim. It's several miles, a couple of miles to swim from the sandbanks to Deal. But one made it. A very good story of the mayor of Deal commandeered a customs boat. The customs men said, there's no way we're going out to rescue anyone. And he basically commandeered the boat and took some townspeople, and they went and rescued backwards and forwards, trying to rescue as many sailors as they could. Great story. Another one where a ship was blown right across the North Sea, ended up in Sweden from Harwich, or just off Harwich. Another one where a ship was taken from Helston in Cornwall, or near Helston, the Helford River, and was swept out to sea. One man and two cabin boys on board. That was it. And they clung for dear life as the ship was basically taken all the way along the south coast of England that night. You can't imagine how terrifying it was. Windmills went so fast, were blown so fast, they actually caught fire. Can you imagine that? In London, a couple of the lakes, I think it could have been the lake in St. James's Park. The wind swept it so much that fish were actually flicked out, and the next day the bank was just lined with fish that had been flicked out it was almost like a mini tornado coming through. Tiles, chimneys collapsing all over London. The Bishop of Bath and Wells was killed when his palace collapsed in Bath. Queen Anne herself had to be evacuated from King James's palace because the chimneys were collapsing. So, biblical moment. So if any of you are interested, go and have a look at that one later. And as I say, description in the bottom. And I'm just looking here. Jonesy, Pegasus Bridge in the thumbnail. Have been there many times. Yes. and it is, and Madame Gondry's Cafe, lovely woman, thank you. Francisco Piera, good afternoon, thank you, and good afternoon to you too. John, Chris, any chance you'll visit us here in the States to do some videos? The Maritime Museum I worked for has a replica brig that still sails from the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. Wow. Would love to come over. Someone's asked me if I'd come to Australia as well. I mean, hey, I'll do a road trip. Someone might have to pay me the odd penny so I can do it. Don't forget, of course, the States. We've got the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming up, 1776. So we've got that coming up in 2 years' time, and I'll certainly be turning my guns, as it were, on the Revolutionary War, because it's something that the Brits don't know too much about. Surprise, surprise, because we lost, and it wasn't against the French or Germans, so we tend not to worry too much about those sort of wars. Most people in Britain don't know a lot about the American Revolutionary Wars, and of course, don't forget, of course, in the States, it's part of a national narrative, which is, of course, evil King George and the Redcoats versus patriotic Americans. And of course, it was never as clear cut as that. There were plenty of Americans, minority probably, but a significant minority, who was certainly ambivalent and probably actually supported the king. And of course, many loyalists left America after the wars of independence. And those of you who are Sharp fans of Richard Sharp and Bernard Cornwell's novels will know that Sharp fought alongside a former colonial or officer from North America. I can't remember his name now. I bet someone who's a Sharp fan is going to put it in here. Anyone who's a Sharp fan, please put it in here. But he was and Francisco, yeah, I didn't realize that you were in Lisbon, but it is a great city. And yes, I would have more than happily done a trip for you there. Anyway, let's crack on. So I've done the football battalions. We've done a bit of Lisbon. Chris, love the channel. Any good book recommendations on the Boer War? I've got several. The one I can immediately show you. Let me just grab it off my bookshelf. The Boer War by Thomas Pakenham. Some people have accused him of being a little bit too pro-Boer and anti-British. Yeah, but everyone has an opinion somewhere, and you're going to tick someone off. Interesting, I was watching a podcast. It was on YouTube, actually, but a podcast today about Israel-Palestine. And Rory Stewart was on it talking, and he was talking with Alistair Campbell. And the two of them were just saying, on that particular one, there are 500 opinions at least, all differing. And it's a little bit like this, when's a historian right or wrong? But yeah, it's a good starter for 10. Thomas Pakenham, the man who also wrote Scramble for Africa, which I find a fascinating book as well. Okay, right, there you go. Tree Goblin says 16,000 French troops helped. I assume, Tree Goblin, you talk about the American War of Independence and not the Boer War. Although interestingly, there was a French general on the Boer side, obviously not sent by the French government, retired and doing his own thing, but he'd been in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was now on the Boer side. Some interesting foreign interventions on the Boer side, including some Irish volunteers as well. Where were the French in 1812? Someone says. I guess they were fighting in Europe principally. I guess they didn't have enough troops to send over to the United States. And John Schultz said in Russia. Yeah, they were. Most of them were, at any rate. So Napoleon didn't have time to be fighting in Russia and in the USA. And of course, the interesting thing was, the War of 1812, which dragged on till 1815. What would have happened if after Napoleon's defeat, the British had decided to ramp things up and send an army to Canada under the Duke of Wellington? Fortunately, we never know. I don't think it would have ended up, I think, personally, in probably a very inconclusive war. Maybe one of those classics where the British would have won some of the major cities, but not been able to hold the countryside, and would have been a classic guerrilla campaign in the States. But that's my view. I could be completely and utterly wrong. Hello, Dalton. Nice to see you here. One of my subscribers, one of my members of my of my channel. So thank you very much for your support, Dalton. Thank you very much indeed. Right, anyway, let's crack on with what happened in British history this week. That's the whole reason for giving these little, well, that's the central thread I'm going to try and do with these Friday talks. So what have we got for you this week in British history? 30th of October, 1485, Henry VII is crowned. Henry VII is crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. Previously, just in the August, he had defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. This is Henry Tudor. So this is the first monarch in the House of Tudor. And as I say, he's crowned on the 30th of October, 1485. And we won't go into all the ins and outs of the Wars of the Roses. It sort of brings the Wars of the Roses, or his ascension to the throne brings the Wars of the Roses to a conclusion of a fashion. Arguably, he wasn't really a Lancastrian, he was a Tudor. So we actually had, it was the last time we had a change of crown in England by force of arms, a change of dynasty by force of arms. Some of you who came on my live talk about the Germans and the Jacobites last week might recall that, of course, James II was forced off the throne, but he was replaced by his daughter and son-in-law. So there wasn't a change of dynasty. Okay. Thank you. Remember to like the video. Oh yes, please like my videos. YouTube, I get an extra brownie points. YouTube's an interesting beast. Shall I just go off piece of minute? Everyone knows there's a YouTube algorithm. Obviously, YouTube keep that algorithm really close to their chests, because otherwise there will be people like me probably trying to manipulate it, and many others. I hasten to add, I'm not out there trying to manipulate the system, but they certainly like likes. They certainly like the amount of time you spend watching videos. They like the amount of comments you get. They like the fact that you then stay on YouTube, either watching more of my videos or Mark Felton's or someone else's. Yeah, there's loads of stuff going on there about YouTube. Yeah, anyway, there you go. So thank you very much. So please like or comment or whatever. That's cool. Right, 31st of October, apart from being Halloween, 31st of October, 1917, the Battle of Beersheba in modern day, well, Israel. People called Palestine at the time in the First World War. This was part of in many respects, a forgotten war. Again, the Brits, Australians remember it, and there's a reason for that in a minute, which we'll talk about. But the Brits we are so fixated by the Western Front in the First World War, we don't realise that actually British servicemen fought in many other locations, in Italy, in Salonika, which is sort of northern Greece, against principally the Bulgarians. People have heard of the Dardanelles and Gallipoli, and normally in the same breath, it's something about something about Winston Churchill messing it up in the sense it was his baby and ill thought through, etc., etc. Depends where you are on the Winston Churchill thing, of course. Yet another one of those paradigms. Yeah, where do people stand and view the world? Winston Churchill is either an incredible hero or he's an incredibly flawed person. Depends where you are. I would go for the hero option, but I accept he was a flawed hero. And certainly a man who was always, I think, was probably principally about Winston most of the time. But one of the stories I do love about Winston Churchill was when his wife basically told him in the 1930s they were running out of money. He'd lost a lot of money on the Wall Street crash, and his wife basically, Clementine, told him they needed to cut costs. And he basically just said, I'll just write another article for a newspaper and get paid a bit more. And that seemed to be the way he lived his life. So, an interesting bloke, And even by the time he was prime minister, probably a man of a different age. He was an Edwardian, late Victorian, not necessarily a man of his age, but cometh the hour, cometh the man, certainly in 1940. Anyway, where were we at? So, First World War. So the Brits were involved there. They were also involved in places like East Africa, and we're involved in the Middle East. And of course, that's because the British had a vested interest in the Suez Canal, and the Ottoman Turks had allied with Germany eventually, and had attacked the Suez Canal. And there was a bitter battle going on in what we now call what is the Sinai Peninsula. The British were slowly pushing the Ottomans back. And by the 31st of October 1917, the British Imperial forces attacked the Ottoman, and with some German help, Ottoman and German positions at Beersheba in what's now southern Israel. It involved, of course, for my Australian fans, it involved the cavalry charge of the 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments, who were actually armed. They charged with bayonets. And it was one of the great last charges, certainly in British Army or British Imperial Army warfare, and one of the last big successful ones, of course. Battle of Beersheba, General Allenby was now able to turn the Ottoman flank, the Turkish flank, at Beersheba, and start to push into the rest of Palestine, say modern-day Israel. By the 11th of December, General Allenby was entering Jerusalem. They captured Jerusalem. So yeah, that's the Battle of Beersheba, 31st of October, 1917. And interesting, Allenby, an interesting person. I studied him at university, not in depth, but Allenby was one of those generals who proved, I think the British generals have a very bad press from the First World War. And it was a bad press that's been sort of continued. We had Oh, What a Lovely War, which is all about, that film from the 1960s, about incompetent upper-class generals, toffs, aristos, who obviously didn't know about the men, didn't know how to fight a war. Has probably been pushed on. Blackadder Goes Forth was, very much a parody in a similar sort of vein. Interestingly, when I studied the Western Front in the First World War, the point that was made with some of my lecturers was, number one, the war was very, very different to anything the British generals had ever fought before. Okay, it wasn't like fighting the Boers. It certainly wasn't fighting like the Mahdi's men or anything like that. So this was a new war, and it was a new technological war. For instance, the battlefronts were over miles now. You couldn't just sit on a horse on top of a hill and watch what was going on. Kitchener at Omdurman was able to basically see what the hell was happening on the whole battlefield. That was not the case in the First World War. And basically, we had these big battlefronts and no ability to easily communicate. So you didn't actually know what the hell was happening at the front all the time. That's one thing. Second thing is, British generals actually were no more incompetent than the French generals, who sent hundreds of thousands of their men to their deaths, or the German generals, who did likewise, or the Austrian generals, or the Russian generals. And indeed, General Pershing, when he brought the Americans over at the back end of 1917, he'd had 3 years to watch, the idiots from the British generals and others, and would obviously have a new way of fighting the war. And actually, General Pershing's solution was send as many Americans over the top as you possibly could, force of numbers, try and break through. So maybe British generals have, over history, have had maybe a harder press than they necessarily deserve. One of the interesting things is General Allenby proved that where you had, and don't forget, on the First World War, you were enclosed. You had a front that stopped at the Swiss border and at the English Channel. So a very small front. And if you couldn't break through, how the hell did you, how on earth, apart from maybe an amphibious landing in northern Germany or something, how did you break through? And General Allenby proved that in the wider spaces of the Middle East, British generals could still use space and could be successful. But anyway, that's a complete by the by, and I get the feeling that could be a pub talk sometime. Oh, speaking of pub talks, before I go on, here's one for you. Who would be interested in a weekend with the History Chap? It's just an idea. I was talking to someone last week, and there is the potential that we could do something where maybe we just get a small house. So it'd be a small gathering, intimate gathering, maybe turn up on a Friday night in the English Midlands, because that's probably halfway to everywhere. At least it is if you're in England. And I tell some stories over effectively around the fire on Friday night. Maybe we do something like a battlefield tour on the Saturday in the region, and again another series of chats around a fire with a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and some food on Saturday night. Is anyone interested in that? Don't know. Any of you who are members of or on my newsletter list, okay, by all means, if you don't want to comment here, send me an email via my website at thehistorychap.com. And anyone who's not a member of my newsletter, please sign up and become a member of my newsletter. You get told every week what's my latest videos, what the hell I'm doing, new courses or programs I'm putting together. I'm currently putting one together for January, all about the English Civil War, and that's going to be like a mini series of talks. There'll also be live sessions within that, and a whole lot of resources. So it's going to be sort of a bit more than just a series of videos. Okay. Anyway, where are we at? So if you're interested in that, please do. Great idea. I thought you meant coming to Texas. Long time since I've been to Texas. So RV at the beach. I will come to Texas if you'd like me to come to Texas, but I'm going to have to get a pass out from Sarah, aren't I? I don't think she'll be too impressed, but she might like the shopping in Texas. Who knows? We have a Midland here in Michigan too. That's not the Midlands I'm talking about, John. Midlands of England, old pubs and lovely framed buildings. Anyway, where are we? Let's get into November. 1st of November, 866. We're going back in time here. 1st of November, 866. The Great Heathen Army. This is the Vikings, folks. The Great Heathen Army invades England and captures the city of York. Golly, I could do a whole talk on the Great Heathen Army, and indeed, I've done a video about Alfred the Great, where I do talk about him. So if any of you are interested, I haven't put a link in there, sorry about that. But if you go to the History Chap and type in Alfred the Great, it will come up. It will give you a background story. But basically, Vikings, as we would tend to call them, Vikings were basically, as a verb, Danish and Norwegian pirates, had been attacking the British shores for some time. And eventually in 866, for about 70 years. Vikings, by the way, it was just a term. It basically meant going off and pirating, basically. So there was no nationality called Vikings. And different stages and very rarely in Anglo-Saxon time were they ever called Vikings. It wasn't a term that was used. They were called heathens because they were not Christians. They were called Norse, which tended to refer to the Norwegians, or Danes. Not surprisingly, they're the Danish people. And England, but Britain in particular, Ireland and Scotland as well, and the Welsh, had a running battle for several hundred years with these sea-born raiders who started off really as pirates, pirate raids. But in 866, it all changed. The pirates came together and formed a massive army and effectively invaded England. This wasn't an opportunistic, let's rock up at a monastery stuck out on a headland somewhere. And let's face it, as I said, pirates, people had this thing that the Vikings were, or the Danes and Norse, were anti-Christian. They weren't anti-Christian per se, although there were some elements there. What they were pirates. And what they looked for was easy, rich pickings. And monasteries at the time were rich pickings, massively rich pickings, and they were easy. They were stuck out by their very nature as monasteries. They were stuck out on headlands, like Lindisfarne up on the northeast coast of England, like Iona off the west coast of Scotland. Fabulously rich. Out on a limb, there was no royal army anywhere near them, and just for good measure, they were protected by monks or nuns. So if you were a Viking, why would you attack someone like London, which was a big walled city where there was a royal presence and a royal army, when you could rock up at a monastery or small trading towns? 866, it all changed. Massive invasion army, led by, in theory, the sons of, or two of the sons of, Ragnar Lothbrok, legendary, mythical Norse leader. And those of you who've followed things like Vikings as a series, you'll probably know about Ragnar Lothbrok, or at least the stories that are told of him. Anyway, Great Heathen Army rocked up, and it arrived in East Anglia. And the East Anglia was a kingdom, separate kingdom there was no England at this time. It was all separate little kingdoms. Some people have called it now the Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms. There was Wessex. There was Sussex and Kent, who had now been sort of consumed by Wessex. There was Essex. There was, where are we? Oh, I've gone wrong. We've got East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria. And the king of East Anglia, they rocked up in East Anglia, and the king of East Anglia took one look at this Harold Hardrad, Viking legend, the guy from, yes, maybe I'll talk about Hardrad, maybe I won't, because I'll go off down another rabbit hole. But turned up in East Anglia, king of East Anglia, thought, what do I do? Do I take these lot on? And he didn't. He basically paid them off to clear off and go somewhere else. Interestingly, they didn't just want gold and loot. They also demanded lots of horses. Why would a whole group of pirates in their longships want horses? Well, suddenly they moved from being just pirates on longships, where they could only go where rivers and where the boats would go, to suddenly being a mounted infantry. And what they did, they mounted up. They left East Anglia, true to form. They accepted that. They rode up. They rode up through the eastern part of England, through what was actually the kingdom of Mercia. And the Mercian kings really had two choices, didn't they? They could fight this cavalry that was going through their lands, or they could just ignore them and hope they go away. And so they went and ignored them, hope they go away. And they did. They went up into the kingdom of Northumbria. Northumbria at the time was in a civil war between different dynasties who were trying to control the Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, or Angle kingdom of Northumbria. And I said just now that the Vikings liked easy targets, like monasteries protected by monks saying prayers. They also quite liked kingdoms divided amongst themselves. So Northumbria was a fantastic place to attack. And basically they defeated the Northumbrian army, or the various factions of the Northumbrian army, and then occupied York. And that happened on the 1st of November, 866. For the rest of the story about the Vikings in England, and indeed the Vikings elsewhere in the British Isles, including Dublin, of course, which became was a Viking settlement, Dublin, where they principally traded Irish slaves. But for the rest of all of that, we'll have to wait for another time, maybe another series or series of videos. How about that? 1st of November, 1848. From the sublime to the ridiculous, we have Vikings taking over York. 1st of November 1848 at Euston Station in London. W.H. Smith opened his first ever bookstall, and that was the beginning of the retail chain W.H. Smith, who are found on almost every British high street now. But that was their very first one, Euston Station, 1848, 1st of November. Just going to go back and have a quick look here. Vikings were the first to discover the New World as well, long before, I guess they're the first Europeans to discover the New World. I guess Native Americans had already discovered it, hadn't they? Not least crossing over from Siberia, I guess. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Vikings were there long before, or arrived in North America long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Great stories, the Vikings, actually. We now see them as, as I say, raping, pillaging, and men wearing helmets with horns. By the way, they didn't. That was a Victorian invention. But nevertheless, but incredible seafarers. Trading, as someone just said, there was it, the guy from Celtic Alpha V. The Vikings were the first to discover the North Pole, so they got all the way across the North Sea in Viking longboats. They also travelled into Russia. They travelled down to Byzantium. They travelled, which is now modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. They travelled in, both they did that through the rivers of Russia, but they also travelled round through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean that way as well. Incredible seafarers. Other questions. Blackpool is full of Vikings. It certainly is on stag do's, I can assure you. Didn't they also act as mercenaries? Yes. Viking. They were out basically to better themselves. If they could settle somewhere and farm it, that's cool. If they could steal stuff, that was cool. If they could be paid to be mercenaries, that was cool. If they could be paid like the King of East Anglia to basically bugger off, that was cool as well. Anything to make some money. And yes, they certainly, and many, including Harold Hardrada, fought and were mercenaries in the bodyguard of the Emperor of Byzantium in modern-day Istanbul. Oh, I like this QA library. If you're ever in deepest Essex, St. Peter's in the Wall is the UK's oldest working chapel, with bricks from the walls and docks that the Romans built. It was built to convert Vikings to Christians. The chapel was built to convert Vikings to Christians. Wow. And Dalton Weeks, I think you and I have just been saying the same thing. The elite guard of the Byzantine emperors, the Hungarian guard, were or some of them were Vikings at different stages. And Harold Hardrada, who in English history, of course, Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, he'd been one of the commanders. 1st of November, we will get off the 1st of November in a minute, 1914, Battle of Coronel off the coast of Chile in the First World War. This was a German fleet, absolutely outgunned a British fleet. 2 British light cruisers were sunk. 1,600 Royal Navy men lost their lives. The Germans had 3 men injured or wounded. It was a Admiral von Spee was trying to take his little fleet that had been based in China at the beginning of the First World War in a German colony in China. He was trying to get back to Germany. He sailed all the way across the Pacific. He was going to come round the bottom of South America, Cape Horn, up through the Atlantic. He was intercepted by a Royal Navy fleet off the coast of Chile at the Battle of Coronel, and in the ensuing battle, he absolutely blasted the Royal Navy aside. Sailed round the bottom of South America, and was then intercepted himself by a British fleet off the Falkland Islands, and the Battle of the Falkland Islands in December 1914. Von Spee was his flagship was sunk, and he was killed. Ironically, at the beginning of the Second World War, a ship named in his honour, the Graf von Spee, was scuttled itself at the River Plate in Uruguay, having been in the same sort of southern Atlantic oceans as von Spee himself had been at the beginning of the First World War. There you go. The Falklands War, no one remembers, Davy. Yes, Davy 1602. Yes, it is. It's the Falklands War no one remembers, but a significant one. And after the Battle of Coronel, which was a disaster, don't forget the last time the British had come up against a European fleet of equal size, of equal caliber, was back in 1805, Battle of Trafalgar. And when there's a little bit against the Danish fleet afterwards, but 1805. And they came up against the Germans in 1914, and this is the first major encounter, and they came off badly, second best. So the Battle of the Falkland Islands was a major attempt not only to cancel the Germans out, but to retrieve some British honour, and not least Royal Navy honour. Okay. Spee. Do beg your pardon. Expat. Spee is pronounced Spee. Thank you. Spee. Admiral von Spee. There you go. Does that sound better? Give me a thumbs up if it is. Right, back right up to present day stuff. Okay. Yes, and John Schultz says, of course, one of them, they all went off with von Spee, except one from the China Squadron, German China Squadron, which was the Emden, which went to Indian Ocean. And I've done a video about the Emden. So have a look. Again, I haven't done a description. I haven't done a link in the descriptions, but have a look for you there, okay? You might have spotted in the news, I mentioned the Battle of Beersheba and the fact it was in Israel, or was the Ottoman province of Palestine at the time, Syria. But 2nd of November, 1917, so actually only 2 days after the Battle of Beersheba in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Golly, I am not even going to attempt to try and do a history of Israel, Palestine, history of the Middle East in the next few minutes, because I want to be done by the top of the hour. But the Balfour Declaration, during the First World War, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, wrote to Baron Rothschild, a leading Jewish financier, leading Jewish supporter of the British war cause in Britain, wrote a letter to him, which then later got published in the Times, where he basically said that the British government supported the idea of a national home for Jews in Palestine, which was a laudable idea. There's some politics there, because what he was trying to do was obviously make sure that both the Jewish population in Britain, as well as the United States and France, supported the Allied cause, and undermined Jewish support in Germany for the German cause, and the Austrians as well, for that matter. So it was a two-pronged attack. He basically said that there would be this national home, or British government supported the idea of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Only problem was, of course, biblically, 2,000 years ago, Jews had lived in Palestine till the Germans, till the Romans kicked them out, having they'd failed in a rebellion against the Romans. Of course, the final redoubt was the fortress of Masada in the Dead Sea desert. Jews were basically, as a punishment, were thrown to all corners of the world, known world at the time. So we're a big Jewish diaspora out to places like what's now modern-day Iran, somewhat ironic based on where we're at with current history, Yemen, a lot across North Africa, of course, big Jewish population in places like Spain and Portugal, and of course in Eastern Europe as well. So Balfour basically said, well, they would have a national home in Palestine. Great idea. Unfortunately, in the intervening 2,000 years, Palestine had been inhabited by Arabs, mainly Muslim, some Christian Arabs as well. And obviously, we now had this great idea. We would have a Jewish home in a place where there were already Arabs. Interestingly, Britain gets a bit of a tough stick for this one. It's like, there are people out there. Britain created the whole Israel-Palestine Middle East debacle. We certainly have more say in it than, I don't know, Argentina or someone. I appreciate. But what was interesting in the Balfour Declaration was that he actually then went on to say in the Balfour Declaration that despite there being a national home, there would be nothing would prejudice the civil and religious rights of people already living there. And equally, actually, interestingly, and nothing would prejudice the rights of Jews living anywhere else in the world. In other words, you couldn't then say, well, if you want rights as a Jew, you need to go over there because actually we're just going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. It opened a Pandora's box. Britain ended up with a mandate from the League of Nations after the First World War to run Palestine, as it was called at the time. And we had this group of Zionists who were now taking Britain for her word that, you said we could have a national home here, so here we come. And a whole lot of Arabs were also saying, you promised us independence at the end of this war after we'd rebelled against the Turks. And by the way, what the heck is this new group of people doing here? British found themselves partly in a situation of their own making, but basically being attacked by both sides. Long story short, okay? But I'm not sure if Davey, the Freudian slip. I know what Freudian slip you're talking about, mate. Yes. So anyway, Balfour Declaration was on the 2nd of November, 1917, and a crucial part of the establishment of both the state of Israel and the whole problem we have now in the Middle East. And yeah, it's one of the seeds to currently where we're at. And someone else has put here, formats, so Sykes-Picot should be blamed more than Balfour. Yes, is the answer. I won't go into all. There were three things going on. Don't forget, when you're fighting a war, you promise all things to all people. And, it wasn't just the Jews and the Arabs who were being promised stuff. People being promised stuff all around the world. And in their own countries. Women were being promised they would get the vote if they helped in the war effort in Britain. So there's lots of promises people are made in wars. Always have been, always will be. Problem in Middle East, or specifically in what we're now called Israel-Palestine, that area, was we'd had the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, which basically the British had originally said to Arabs, or to the Arab leadership in what's now Saudi Arabia, the Hashemites, if you raise a rebellion against the Ottomans, we will give you some form of self-government. You will give you independence. Okay, so we had Arabs now believing if they joined in the big Arab revolt, that's where Lawrence of Arabia fits in of a fashion, then they'll get independence. Okay, we then had the Balfour Declaration promising the Jews a national home, but at no one else's expense. Interesting square to circle. And then we had the Sykes-Picot agreement, secret agreement, where the British and French decided they would actually divide most of the Middle East into their own spheres of influence. Yeah. You just had disabled Welshman. You had a bloody advert in the middle of Chris talking. Apologies. I've got no hand on it. That's YouTube, I'm afraid. But nevertheless, so Israel Palestine, a fascinating area, and it does make me think. Someone's actually asked me recently, would I think about doing history sort of outside of British history? And I don't know, what do people think? I mean, it's obviously I've got a passion for British history. I actually think I probably got a passion for history, full stop, because I love knowing why we are where we are, good and bad. QA library. Did the women pre-war look at taking the government to court for not being able to vote? Not sure they did. Not sure they did, but I stand to be corrected on that. I'm not an expert on women's suffrage in Britain, apart from real top line stuff. But yeah, but anyway, maybe I should tell some more stories from elsewhere in the world. I'm always just very conscious of people saying, like me telling, I don't know, American history, and people saying, how the hell, you with your accent, can you tell us about our country's history? I don't know. Maybe I'm just someone who sounds like I, tell interesting stories no matter where I'm from, and I try my best to go down the middle of the road. Don't always get it right, but I do try. How about Anglo-Irish history? And funny enough, that's one that I definitely would like to cover at some stage, because again, in Britain, it's not really understood. The IRA, people know the IRA existed and set off bombs in both mainland Britain, attacked British soldiers in Northern Ireland, and after that, they don't know very much, and they know that there's lots of Americans who seem to be more Irish than American, and they don't quite get their heads around that. So Anglo-Irish history would be a really fascinating one to talk about, actually, going right back. Like to do things like that very sensitively. I'm aware that probably a lot of the history between Britain and the United States, for instance, isn't that sensitive. All right, War of Independence, 1812, but there weren't massive atrocities and things like that. There were some, but not massive. Not compared to Anglo-Irish history, or Israel-Palestine, or indeed, I've had viewers from South Africa, Afrikaner viewers, who tell me about the British concentration camps during the Boer War. So I like to try and treat stuff sensitively and appreciate that actually, whilst it might not affect me personally, there are other people whose families it did affect and will have very, very strong opinions, one way or t'other, on different conflicts. But I would like to go into Anglo-Irish history, because I think it's a crucial part of British history, actually. By the way, St. Patrick was a Welshman. Yes, he was. In fact, here's the irony, actually. Who just had that? Expat. Of the four patron saints of the British Isles, St. Patrick, St. Andrew, St. George, St. David, the only one who's actually born in the country that they're the patron saint of is St. David. And he's probably the one that's least known. But there you go. There's a lot of propaganda to filter with that one. Davy, I'm assuming you're thinking of Anglo-Irish history. You might be thinking about the Boer War as well. Don't know. Anglo-Scottish history is brutal. It is indeed. Plenty of time for that. British campaign in Africa, von Lettow-Vorbeck in the Great War. That's coming. The British, the war in East Africa is coming on YouTube with Chris Green, the history chap. Okay, let me just finish off. We've got two more for you for this week, and then we can clear off. 3rd of November, 1783, the last public hanging at Tyburn. So there we go. We go from the Balfour Declaration and the Middle East to a corner of London, Tyburn, Tyburn's Tree, where they, for hundreds of years, criminals had been hanged in public executions. And the last person to be hanged on the 3rd of November, 1783 at Tyburn was a man called John Austin. John Austin was convicted of highway robbery. Actually, he'd murdered a farm labourer on a highway. He tried to rob him. We're not talking Dick Turpin, stand and deliver, two guns, and young ladies in distress and lords and ladies in their carriages. This was much more brutal, low life. He attacked a farm labourer on a country road, tried to rob him, killed him, and that was classified as highway robbery. So definitely not Dick Turpin or the Wicked Lady. He was hanged at Tyburn. It was the last public hanging. Traditionally, public hangings at Tyburn were massive spectator events. You know, I say in a lot of my history stories, you know, you've got to judge history or the events by their times, you know, whether it's Winston Churchill or anything else. And yeah, but back in the day, public executions were like a spectator sport. Rather like going to see the baseball or soccer or football or cricket. Um, this was, you know, this is almost akin to almost going back to the gladiator days, wasn't it? And in fact, in 1714, Jack Sheppard, famous highwayman, was hanged at Tyburn, and it's estimated that 250,000 people turned up to watch his execution at Tyburn. Now, massive celebrity events, public executions. There's a story when I lived in Nottingham. There was a public execution in Nottingham. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't just down at Tyburn in London, and it was such a spectacle. You know, the crowd would leave Nottingham to go up the Mansfield Road towards where the hangings took place, top end of Mansfield Road, round where Goose Fair takes place now. Those of you who know Nottingham, and on the showground. And the convicted person would be in a cart, and they would go to this. As they went up the Mansfield Road, there was a particular pub, tavern, where the publican would come out and give, you know, it's a bit like a sales ploy. You know, he would give the condemned man his last drink, and it was almost like oh, and by the way, while he's having his drink, pile in, get yourselves one, but I'm charging the rest of you for it. So the crowd were all there. And he came out and he gave this man his pint, and he basically said, you know, I'm teetotal. I'm a Methodist, I think he might have been, or a Puritan, but I'm teetotal, and I will not go to my maker with alcohol in my breath. Which is a bit of a damp squid. Everyone was like, oh God, all right, yeah. So publican had to go back inside. No one went in for a beer. You know, the procession continued, and he was hanged. And the legend is that, you know, as his last twitches from his hanging, a galloper rode in with a pardon for him. And I think that might have just been a story from from those who supported drinking, you know, because it's very much of the line. If he'd stayed at the pub and had his pint, he probably wouldn't have been hanged. But there you go. So 3rd of November 1783, the last public hanging at Tyburn. I'd like to do a talk or series of talks next year on Britain's highwaymen and highwaywomen, because there were a couple. Don't know what you think about that. Anyone up for highwaymen? A bit of a highwayman story. I know it's not military history, but you know, do we go back into a bit of social history there? I don't know. Give us your thoughts. Ronald, very good, very droll, Ronald. So my man in Nottingham, he was on the wagon. You've got a career in stand up there, there, Ronald. Thank you very much for that. 4th of November, Dick Turpin rides again. Social history's cool. I think it is. As you can tell from a lot of my things, I tend to end up in a slightly more political, military area, but I do like some of the social history. What about the revelers up in Scotland, or Scottish English borders? Oh yes, was it the Reivers? Anyway, highwaymen would be interesting. Yes, I want to hear about the highwaymen and women too. And the women bit, by the way, that's not me trying to be woke. Okay, there's a very famous highwaywoman, Lady Ferrers, and she actually came from my neck of the woods, where I was being brought up in Hertfordshire. And she supposedly haunts. She was shot, eventually died. She haunts the common outside Wheathampstead, where I was brought up in Hertfordshire. And yeah, I know a couple of people who claim to have seen them. One had been a pathfinder in the Second World War. You know, the guys who used to go in before the bombing raids in Germany, they'd go in low, they'd actually drop in sentries, which almost acted like landing strips. So the bombers flying high could see where to come. So these guys came in low, ACAT guns going everywhere. Now this guy, actually in the 1970s, he reckons he encountered a ghost of the Wicked Lady on No Man's Land Common in Wheathampstead. And you've got to say, you know, when you've been a pilot like that in action in the Second World War, you possibly don't make up tall stories. Maybe you do. And I know someone else who's a farmer who F's and Jeffs, and yeah, definitely does not believe in fairies. He had an interesting experience there as well. Anyway, so there is the Wicked Lady, and she will be part of my talks if we do highwaymen. Last but not least, 4th of November, 4th of November, 1839, the Newport Rising in South Wales, the last armed rebellion in Britain. 1839, Queen Victoria already on the throne. The Chartists were a working class movement who were challenging authority. They wanted some outrageous things. They were seen as like the Bolsheviks of their day. They wanted things like elections for Parliament, one man, one vote, equal sized constituencies, MPs to be paid so that they didn't have to be a member of the aristocracy with their own means. Well, that was all big rebellious stuff in the 1830s, and several of their leaders were arrested in South Wales. Other Chartists decided to march on the town to release them. They arrived in Newport, where the local militia opened fire on them. They killed 22. There was a major battle in Newport. 22 of the Chartists protesters were killed, and the leaders were arrested and sentenced to hang, drawing, and quartering or to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for being traitors for an armed rebellion. It was the last time that anyone was ever convicted of or was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in English history or British history. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in Australia. They were sent on convict ships to Australia. But that was the last big rising. Could go into that in more detail, but I won't for the minute. Could go into hang, drawing, and quartering in more detail as well. Interesting symbolism behind it. It wasn't just a vicious, nasty act. Well, it was. It was a vicious, nasty act, but there was a lot of symbolism around it from medieval times. Anyway, and speaking of hang, drawing, and quartering, how can I finish, especially for my Brits? This weekend, Sunday night, 5th of November, it's Guy Fawkes night, bonfire night. If you're interested in the whole Guy Fawkes story, I've put a link down below. This was an attempt, for those of you who don't know, this was an attempt by a disaffected group of Catholics, Roman Catholics, to blow up King James I of England, King James VI of Scotland, when he attended Parliament. It was one of the principal men involved was Guy Fawkes, although he wasn't the brains behind the operation. He was just the man with the military experience. But nevertheless, a fascinating story, fascinating for how this Catholic group of men came together, and indeed what their plans were, or indeed weren't, and how close did they come to succeeding. Fascinating story, and have a look and celebrate Bonfire Night and Guy Fawkes 1605 in my video that I've given you a description of down below. So that's me done, folks, for today. Friday afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed it. Actually, it wasn't a coffee with Chris. It was water with Chris. I've overdone the coffee. I do coffees in the morning, water in the afternoon, mainly to rehydrate from all the coffees I've had in the morning. But I hope you found that interesting. A video on Adam Ant, Arrow. Adam Ant, for those of you who don't know, some of you must know, God, 1980s pop star in England, and he had the great hit Stand and Deliver, where he was this sort of highwayman. I am the dandy highwayman. Great song if you want to go and see it. It's bound to be on YouTube. I'd also look up Horrible Histories Highwayman's song. It's a take the Mickey out of Adam Ant. It tells this real story, or in Horrible Histories terms, the real story of Dick Turpin, the gentleman highwayman who definitely wasn't a gentleman. But anyway, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed it. As I say, links below if you want to join up or sign up for my newsletter, totally free. And it just tells you, what's going on in my life and what's going on with new videos coming out, new podcasts coming out, and indeed events that happen in British history. And I go into at least little stories every week as well. Normally didn't do this week because I was knackered. I only got in from, as I say, I arrived home about 1 o'clock this morning from my Lisbon travels. And anyone who would like to support me and the work I do, please sign up for my membership channel. You get exclusive videos there. I'm not going to do a hard sell. But I'm really trying not to go down the route. I know there's YouTube adverts, but do you know there are people that do YouTube placements inside their videos where I'll be sitting here saying, and before I go on, I just want to talk about this lovely glass of water from such and such a company, and I try and somehow weave it into a story about, I don't know, Israel, Palestine, or the Anglo-Irish history or something. It's like, how the hell did that come? I really don't want to go down that road. But now, this is becoming my what I want to do: history, telling history. So less and less management consulting, more and more history. So if you can see your way to supporting me, thank you very much. But just join the community by joining the newsletter. I'd appreciate that, and I really appreciate you joining me today and just watching my videos, commenting, liking. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great weekend. The sky is now blue here in Worcester, which is pretty rare because it's the weekend coming. I hope the sky is blue for you too. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.